On this week's special edition of Intelligence is a Dump Stat. It's all about me, folks. One way or another, I have dumped intelligence. It's either because I fought so long against the BroSR ideals of gaming only to now see the brilliant shining light, or because I was correct all along and wasted $15 and literally minutes of my time reading Jeff Rowe Johnson's How to Win at D&D when I should have known better. How do you think this will play out? I'm Daniel. You found your way to Driving and Dragons, and this is Intelligence is a Dump Stat commentary on how to win at D&D. I'll keep the formalities short here. Like, hype, and share the video. Comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. They're all free, and they are critical to helping a small channel like mine gain visibility. My patrons and members got this video early, and their support is greatly appreciated as it will eventually lead to free cars and other great channel activities for all to enjoy. If you're feeling extra kind, leave a super thanks or super chat, and maybe I can at least recoup the expense of the book that I'm reviewing here. Speaking of, let's get this show on the road. First thing I have to say is that I owe Ultra American TTRPG a bit of an apology. He reviewed this and was forced to remove it due to copyright by the publisher, who said he essentially read the entire book on his stream. My first reaction was to laugh and give him the old, dude, you honestly went line by line and gave away the whole thing for free? What did you think would happen? Kind of response. Yeah, I can see now how it would be hard to pull quotes as you would in a traditional review and not essentially read the entire book. To call How to Win at D&D a book is almost laughable. Even the author only refers to it as a primer, but I'd say that even that's a little generous. How to Win is 34 pages, only 27 of which are the actual content, and 12 or more of which are taken up by sketched art appropriately reminiscent of old school Dungeons & Dragons books, and lengthy quotes that are pulled directly from magazine articles and source books for various tabletop role-playing games. That leaves 15 pages of actual content produced from the mind of one Jeff Rowe Johnson. To give a little bit of context, just for comparison, in my upcoming pulp anthology, the Corvid Codex Volume 1, the shortest of the 7 stories is 16 pages. The longest more than doubles the page count. And these are short stories. I would call How to Win at D&D more of an essay than anything else. In what is just a beautiful piece of multifaceted irony. Jeff Rowe states in the introduction that the rules for early games were amateurish and often incomprehensible and in desperate need of an editor. Those ironies will reflect heavily in this review, as this work is the foundation of BroSR obsessive rules as written doctrine and Jeff Rowe's constant use of filler words, exclamations, and expletives. The grammatical kind of expletive, not the swear word kind. In a way, it is written almost as an informal lecture, which is extremely apropos given the online behavior of his most passionate followers. So let's move into the content itself, shall we? As previously mentioned, the intro really sets the tone in more than a few ironic ways. If you ask me to sum up the biggest issue I have with the essay in one word, that word would be assumptions. One could go as far to say it's a straw man, but I don't really feel that it rises to the level of straw man. What the author does is draw a lot of largely unsupported conclusions throughout the piece that are founded in broad sweeping assumptions. Right off the bat, Jeff Rowe lays out the premise that common online complaints regarding scheduling, no-shows, difficulty forming groups are universal and that enduring campaigns are virtually extinct. And he completely ignores the fact that people, especially when they can do so anonymously on the internet, are far more likely to complain than they are to praise. I always heard it as the 97-3 rule. If something good happens to 97% of the time, During the 3% of the time that it's not happening, you can bet your bottom dollar that the person will rush to social media and cry about how the good thing never happens to them. Likewise, is if something bad happens just 3% of the time, you can count on them to bemoan how this thing always happens to them. In either case, 99% of the content that you see online is the 3% screaming.
Take your 33 and a third chance minus my 25% chance, and you got an 8 and a third chance of winning at sacrifice. But then you take my 75% chance of winning, if we used to go one-on-one, and then add 66 and 2/3%, I got 141 and 2/3 chance of winning at sacrifice.
Jeff Rowe presents the complaining online as if it represents the totality of D&D gaming. The first section of the work is titled, Real D&D is a Braunstein. One major flaw in this section is that it gives entirely too much weight and credit to Secrets of Blackmoor documentary by Griff Morgan and Chris Graves. He credits it with permanently changing the discussion surrounding role-playing games and the origins of D&D, and even goes so far as to assert that until it was released, it was rare to even bring up Dave Arneson as a co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons. Maybe things are just different down here in the South, but going back 25 years for me, this wasn't the case. What was typically said was that Gary and Dave had different versions for the game, different visions, and that those visions took them in different directions and ultimately to lawyers. And that fits pretty cleanly with the Braunstein section as it frames what Jeff Rowe presents as the correct way to play D&D in a very Arneson-style manner. And it puts a tremendous amount of praise and credit on the founders and early players of the Braunstein games. He gives a brief synopsis of the early David Wesley run Braunsteins and presents them as these great epic games that everyone celebrated with all the evidence of a Reddit post about the best D&D game ever, and then follows it by asserting that modern D&D campaigns are tepid affairs that turn players into spectators and forbid all independent action with all the veracity of a Reddit post in a D&D horror story thread. And therein lies a critical failure of this primer. It will confirm your priors. Jeff Rowe is in no way persuasive. If you take what he says at face value without any questioning of his premises or assumptions, How to Win at D&D will read like a rallying cry to push your friends to greater heights of role-playing glory. If you are the least bit skeptical, he gives you nothing to repudiate that skepticism. He goes on about how games that promote the multi-character campaign style doesn't allow any one party to hog the spotlight. In all honesty, just on a technical note here, the entire segment following his description of Braunsteins belongs in the following section of his lecture. Nowhere in the preceding paragraphs is the running of multiple characters independently acting in the world discussed by single players anyway. He drops in a section of the 78 AD&D handbook, a book Arneson had nothing to do with, and proceeds to speak about multiple characters acting independently with an individual player. The only tie back to the Wesley Arneson Braunstein concept is that these characters act independently of each other, and that not that single players run multiple characters in the game world. And Jeff Rowe then goes on to make numerous assumptions about how the original creators intended advanced Dungeons & Dragons to be played without bothering to provide any real supporting evidence. For instance, he quotes Boot Hill and points out that it was a TSR game that was specifically designed for Braunstein play, and uses that as proof positive that TSR designers were familiar with the concept and integrated it into AD&D. Well, it does prove the first part, but not the second. Not in the least. They're not the same game. Boot Hill and AD&D are not the same game. They're just both made by TSR and Gary Gygax. This premise, asserted by Jeff Rowe, is no different than me coming up to you and saying that Monopoly play is a core element of Risk because both were Parker Brothers games that are now published by Hasbro. He sets out to prove that AD&D was intended to be played as a Braunstein and offers up as proof a completely separate game created by the same publisher that didn't even involve the influential figures he based the entire opening of the section on. The next section is perhaps the most well-known and enduring tenet of bro philosophy, and unsurprising, it has it has some of the most validity to it: timekeeping. Time is the key to real D&D. This is what the BroSR is most heavily associated with: one-to-one strict timekeeping. It's also where I learned something. I always thought that the term Jeffro-Gygaxian timekeeping was something that others bestowed on, it was just bestowed by others on the concept as a way of saying that this book and Jeffro's efforts revived the concept. What I did not expect was to see it actually in his book. If Jeffro himself coined the term, and this wasn't a creation of an editor, the level of conceit and self-aggrandizement is almost comical here. That aside, this is where Jeffro starts by grossly overstating the importance of strict timekeeping. He opens with the famous all caps line from the 1979 DMG: "You cannot have a meaningful campaign if strict time records are not kept." This is one of those out of context and largely misrepresented sections that he focuses his arguments on. One thing that must be taken into consideration, that is largely ignored here and in various online conversations, is the evolution of language and the difference in the definition of the term campaign. It's kind of like he's reading a Victorian English text that talks about throwing a certain F word on the fire and then proceeds to tell us that the proper way to build a fire involved the treatment of gay people in certain African and Middle Eastern nations. Catch my drift. The way we Catholics deal with heretics. If you read page 86 and 87 of the original Dungeon Master's Guide, you will find that the term campaign has a different connotation than it does today. When we say campaign, we mean a series of sessions related to a group of characters. That's basically what a campaign is. I.e., my Oriental Adventures campaign refers to the adventures of two nobles and two Nezumi in Rokugan who were entrusted with hiding the sleeping emperor. In the 1979 DMG, however, the description of a campaign is more in line with what modern parlance would call a setting. It refers to making a campaign as setting forth on your career as a universe maker. Campaign almost literally means the game world. It's kind of an amalgamation of campaign and setting together. It's like those two, the word campaign separated into setting and campaign. And this was kind of a halfway. And in that regard, timekeeping is essential. You have to have some measure of timekeeping in a living, breathing world. You have to know what everyone is doing and when they're doing it for it to make sense. Be that just one party of PCs and a universe of NPCs or multiple groups of PCs controlled by multiple players. It really doesn't matter. You have to have that kind of consistency. You've got to know when people are doing what. Where the Jeffro train comes off the rails is in that he implies that the same rigidity in that timekeeping is needed regardless of the complexity of the moving parts. If you have several characters per player and numerous parties involved, then yes, a stricter calendar is basically a functional requirement. However, a single party of players running one character each doesn't need or even really benefit from that kind of rigidity. He continues to move through gaming examples, none of which actually require one-to-one timekeeping to function well in game. They simply require the GM to be cognizant of how long things take and what could happen in the world around the character in that time frame. Jeffro then returns to his old habit of barely touching on the advantages that strict timekeeping does provide and follows it up with a whole bunch of unsupported conclusions. He once again fails to make a case that would lead even a neutral reader to assume one of his stances. I seriously question this disappearance of timekeeping from all TTRPGs that the bros like to claim happened before Jeffro, like he went and found the lost book of Moses or something. Maybe I'm misremembering things, but I distinctly recall game shop conversations in the early days of 3rd edition where timekeeping was kind of a hot topic, and then later, particularly in regards to the Living Greyhawk events and whatnot. Either way, this feels like Jeffro would go out and build a sports car and then tell us all that we absolutely have to use a rear live axle to do it right because that's what won at Le Mans in 1940. You know, superior to the independent rear suspension simply because it's older. The final section of the main text is, Real D&D is a fantastic medieval war games campaign. That is one mouthful of a chapter title. Of all the sections of the lecture, this is far and away the worst in my opinion. Filled to its 5-page brim with out-of-context quotes, misrepresentations, and other issues of that ilk, while not really being about what it says it's about. It's not really about wargaming at all. The only tangential association is that in war games, strict, objective, clearly defined rules are an absolute necessity. So by now you have figured out that this section is really Jeffro trying to make the case that Gary Gygax intended for AD&D to be played strictly rules as written as a wargame would be. This is highlighted in the opening inclusion of one of the most misleading Gary Gygax quotes ever printed. A mainstay of the raw fanatics who treat rule books the way young earth creationists treat the Bible. A man wrote into Dragon Magazine taking umbrage with Gary's recent trend of aggressively stating that the AD&D rules were more than just guidelines for developing play. Gary replied that he confused AD&D with D&D because AD&D is a complete system and you either played AD&D or you played something else, going on about strict rules and how basic was more of a framework. Now, Jeffro completely ignores that both before and after this time period, Gary used and promoted numerous house rules, and in numerous writings both before and after, promoted the rules as being guidelines one should adjust or omit as needed for your table. He also ignores that when this was penned, Gary was involved in a lawsuit over royalties, where his entire legal argument was based on the idea that AD&D and D&D were completely separate games meant to be played completely separate ways. And for Jeffro to accept the premise would be an exercise in doublethink on his part, because he applies every concept in the entirety of how to win at D&D equally to both basic and advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Jeffro carries on to misrepresent a section of the preface of the DMG. In this preface, Gary warns that the danger of a mutable system is that players will go too far off in some undesirable direction and make a campaign short-lived. It warns of participants pushing for changes that allow them to grow too powerful too quickly and to take the game out of the DM's hands. Problem is that quote is the death knell of militant raw zealots. In the first sentence, it acknowledges that AD&D is, in fact, a mutable system. What the paragraph does, and it is pretty clear in the context of the rest of the preface, is warn the DM that all changes and adjustments must be well thought out and considered, and that players should not be driving those decisions as they will ultimately become self-serving to the detriment of the game. While the current bulk of 5e-style Dungeon Masters would do well to read that preface over and over again, it doesn't say what Jeffro claims it does, nor does it support his premise in the least. He further attempts to create supporting commentary by quoting a section on outdoor scale. It's all caps, so to Jeffro, this must mean that it's of the utmost word as law imperativeness. And it is. It is imperative to using that system of maps in Minis play in a larger scale combat. He's once again extracting something from one context and trying to paint the entire picture in that color. Johnson sums up the text in an afterword that opens with telling us all that we've been playing the game wrong for decades. Jeffro, of course, publicly stated that Gary was playing the game wrong too. He's publicly told people who actively played with Gary Gygax that they're wrong about how the game was played in the early days and how he played it and intended it to be played. In the end, how to win at D&D isn't going to change any minds. It is effective propaganda for those already inclined to believe its premise, but I found it flawed and utterly unconvincing. If you want a better understanding of the militant rules as written or BroSR mindset, this essay contains some useful insights, and it's only $15. Other than that, it's a conversation piece and a curiosity, but not much more. And it certainly doesn't teach anything, least of all how to win at D&D. Would I recommend it? Maybe if you're a content creator in this space. If you're a game designer and you want to get a better look at the way that segment of the hobby thinks. But if you want to win at D&D, you're far better served opening up your player's handbook or your Dungeon Master's Guide, pulling out your dice with a few good buddies at the kitchen table. I promise you that you will find far more winning there than you will in Jeffro's magnum opus. I'll see you guys next week, where Intelligence as a Dump Stat resumes its normal programming.